Good morning, good evening. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing, we wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you joining us today, we welcome you in. One of the names in the annals of history that comes up over and over again is Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Known to many as the Lady Dracula, she was a fairly aristocratic woman. She was born pretty high up, so high up, in fact, that her husband had to take her name. She didn't have to take her husband's name because she was richer, she had more estates, she had more possessions. Her husband was a military man, and he went off to fight a bunch of wars. And Countess Elizabeth Bathory was actually responsible for maintaining charity in the realm while he was gone. So far, not so bad, huh? It's nice to find somebody pleasant in history, but history rarely tells the whole truth. Countess Bathory, when she was about 47, 48 years old, wound up getting herself arrested. Now, the first reason for this was her husband had been killed in the wars abroad. Actually, I think he made it home, but that's not important. Her husband wasn't there to protect her. Remember, we're talking about the 1500s and 1600s here. It was a very different time, and even though Elizabeth was a woman of wealth, they were still trying to find a way to get her out of the way. So they had a trial, and you have to understand, in the 1500s and 1600s, I don't like using centuries, to be honest, because they're a little bit confusing. Like the 20th century was, 1980s, 1990s, 21st century is 2000, 2010, that kind of thing. So I just prefer saying the 1500s and 1600s. But they, of course, had to have a trial. And for that, they brought up some complainants. Now, these plaintiffs as we know them today, raised a huge stink, making up all sorts of wild accusations. Supposedly, she was running a boarding school for women, and there were women of noble birth that were going missing. This cast quite a pallor on her, and indeed it was reported at the trial that she was drowning virgin girls, cutting their throats out and bathing in their blood. But this was a politically motivated strategy on so many levels. First of all, while Countess Elizabeth Bathory may not have been any more or less noble than the other nobles of her day, she certainly was an independent-minded woman. She knew how to take care of affairs. Her husband had asked her to do it, and she took care of business. The Countess was also a Calvinist. That's a Puritan. Now, the Lutheran Protestant Reformation had only been around for just under a century, and in ancient lands, like she was in Wallachia, Transylvania, for those of you who speak the vernacular, and are representing the Transylvanian nobility, being a heretic when the Ottomans were there knocking on the front door wasn't considered ideal. These charges were not laid with the same standard of evidence as we have today. So literally all I had to do was accuse you of something, and then it would be up to you to disprove it. There was no assumption of innocence. The French courts still do this. You're assumed guilty until proven innocent. The burden of proof is on you. And even though the Countess was very rich, she was politically inconvenient as somebody who wasn't part of the religion that was supposed to be protecting the region. So we have a political motivation for taking her out. Now, it remains political because they didn't put her to death, despite the fact that supposedly she killed many girls. The real figure is somewhat difficult to establish, but somewhere between 50 and a couple hundred. And supposedly she did this all with her own hands, although she did have accomplices. The curious part to this is that accomplices rarely stay silent. When you put them to torture, people tend to confess to almost anything. We all have that noble image in our head of James Bond or Superman being tortured and I'll never give up the information. But there's a reason why torture is still used today, even in our civilized age. I mean, waterboarding is brutal, and even police interrogation techniques are brutal. They'll pretend to be your friend, but they're not being your friend. They just want you to confess so that they can move on to the next person. And it's a lot better than what they used to do. I mean, thumb screws, burning, the rack, all those sorts of torture devices did exist. Now, it's doubtful Elizabeth Bathory was ever subject to torture, but at the same token, she had everything taken away from her. She wound up living on her own estate in kind of a sort of house arrest. Now, the legends that have been passed down to us in the modern days say that she was confined to a room and fed through a slot in the door. But it does seem like she was allowed to roam around her own castle and resume things. That would be the proper thing to do to a woman of her day, because her husband and her had done a good job managing their kingdom, even with these sordid accusations. And eventually, when Elizabeth Bathory turned 50, supposedly she complained to her nurse that she wasn't feeling well, went to bed, and never woke up. This is where the story gets interesting, because in the 1600s, people weren't busy writing stuff down, and often it takes a generation or two for somebody to say, hey, we better write this story down so that people remember it. And that's when the more sordid, the more interesting accounts of her behavior came true. Now, as I said, her family were not saints. They were on the front lines of the Christian defense against the Turkish invaders. And as such, her education would have been relatively similar to her other family member, Vlad Tepes, Vlad Dracul, as you might know them. They were in the same house. Now, what a house is, it's a group of related nobles who can trace their line back to an ancient king, an ancient queen, whatever it might be, whatever it was that gave that house legitimately. The current queen is of the house Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And as you can see there, they had to hyphenate their names because there's a lot of dispute on which house had the most antiquity. Most of the other lines of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha don't exist anymore because, the Germans lost that war. So they kind of had to give up all their Austrian and German titles and become democratic in the process. Well, Countess Bathory was in a similar position. She was really rich. I mean, castles, estates, the love of her people, but by any respect, she was rich. And it wasn't really that unusual for young girls to go missing around that time. I mean, supposedly Countess Bathory was pregnant while she was 13 years old. And of course, they hushed it up, they hid everything, and she got married at, was it 16 or 15? I forget what it was. So they had a couple of years to figure out where that child would disappear to. And of course, Elizabeth wouldn't have making an appearance while that was happening. And it wasn't such a rare thing for it to happen. Now, there's a myth that in the Middle Ages they're all marrying at 15 years old. Romeo and Juliet has spread this. But the fact is, generally people waited till 18 to get married. The reason is the same that we have today. Before that, you're not really mature enough to make any of those decisions. And to be honest, just like in the modern day, they probably weren't mature enough to make them either, but it was societally considered acceptable. Having these young having these young marriages is worth mentioning. And that's why it stands out. So we get this false impression that all through history people were marrying their cousins at 15 years old, and that's why the past was dumb. Well, it wasn't so dumb. Most people were marrying at a healthy age and reacting just like you and I were. They got married at 14. How scandalous. That's also why a few of the monarchs probably went childless, because they got married young and they were still busy playing with toys while, other people were having babies. I don't know why that was so hard to say, but yeah, they were playing with toys while other people were having babies. The Countess Bathory, supposedly, with all of her murders and her four accomplices, despite that, none of the accomplices was punished particularly severely. Normally, that would result in a execution of some sort, a beheading, a hanging, something you can get the crowds to come and watch. And this is the funny part to the Middle Ages. If you murder somebody, it's wrong. But if you hang them or you cut their head off, it's public entertainment. There was no TV back then. There wasn't even a newspaper. Internet? Wi-Fi? Forget it. But what you do is go get yourself a loaf of bread and go down and watch the public executions for a day's entertainment. Because that's what there was. Theater at this time was still considered shocking and provocative. Oh yes, theater. You know, where the Shakespeare people, and Shakespeare is not far removed from this time either, who are chancing about, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio." That was considered scandalous. So much so that the Queen had to personally patronize Shakespeare's work. But Countess Bathory, they didn't want to make a public execution of her, because it would have made the whole family look bad. And the family, like I said, were the front line of defense against the Turks. So they had to just put her away and quietly bury her and hope that the people forgot. Except the people didn't forget. The wonderful thing about the people is they keep memories going. And they remember the sensationalist details. It's like your uncle or your grandfather or your aunt, whoever it is, telling you a story, and they're going to say, "Well, when I was young, I walked to school 3 miles a day, uphill both ways, snowing all the time with a hurricane in my face." Yeah, it was nowhere like that. No, there has been a hurricane in the 1960s in Toronto area, so yes, I do believe some kids were wandering around while the hurricane was happening, because Torontonians don't have a lot of experience with hurricanes. But it doesn't mean that's necessarily what happened. Most parents aren't going to send their kids out in a storm. And in the same way, most people get the information they do by listening to others. So, if I tell you a little bit of a whopper, then you're going to repeat it to somebody else. "Ooh, I heard on the Silverlight show that this happened." The difference is, given that October is nearly upon us, I'm only going to present you the stories that I like. The monsters, the things that go bump in the night. And the Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the blood relative of Count Dracula, who has her own legend of blood and gore. But I'm going to tell it to you from a rational standpoint. Like I said, nobody saw her do anything. So it was always a friend of mine told me this, and that was enough to get her thrown in jail. Now, in the modern days, when we have cameras and we can prove, okay, 2 people went into that room, one person came out, the other person disappeared. Hey, we got a case. But that was hundreds of years away from them, nearly half a millennia. So we can't really look at the conviction, as we're going to call it, against Elizabeth Bathory as proof. If anything, it looks like a political trial and a character assassination, just as what happened to Vlad Tepes, Vlad Dracul, the son of the dragon, also known as Dracula. That area has always been mysterious. And having spent a little time in Europe in the Black Forest and along the Danube, yes, there are some very haunting spectacles, whether they're natural, whether they're architecture, but the people there knew how to draw your attention. And that was because they wanted that to happen. They wanted you to be looking all around you, looking out of the corner of your eyes, seeing what's happening, because they knew only too well how precarious their position was, balanced on the edge of Ottoman territory, having to fight for a cause that they needed to have because, armies in those days would come on in and slaughter everybody, But Elizabeth Bathory, all we know for sure is that during her married life, wasn't such a bad person. Now, whatever happened behind closed doors for all these girls to go missing, that has to remain in the realm of the unproven. Something for tabloids to obsess over. Yes, it's a good mental image to have this Wallachian princess, well, countess, sorry, there is a difference between the two, bathing in the blood of virgins as she orders more to be gutted. Yes, it's an image that appears to us like horror manages to grab your attention. But unfortunately, the evidence just isn't there. The same token, medieval families could be pretty cruel. So it wouldn't surprise me to find out whether it was either case, either a political killing or a mad woman gone insane because her husband was gone most of the time and she wanted to capture the secret of eternal youth. At any rate, her eternal youth lasted till she was 50 years old. Not a bad age for those times, but the same token, people did get older. The average death age is really heavily skewed in the Middle Ages because so many people died when they were young, either as infants or as children, winding up in the usual mischief, except they didn't have hospitals the same way we did. They didn't have medical technology anywhere close than we do. And this is why the average age of death is so horrifyingly low. Because, quite honestly, people died young because there wasn't the cleanliness, there wasn't the sanitary nature. There just simply wasn't a way to keep them around. So Elizabeth Bathory making middle age was something of an accomplishment. And that too meant people would look at her and say, she survived this long. That must mean she's got something special going on. Golden anniversaries, jubilees, stuff like that just simply didn't happen. So, by very virtue of her longevity, by very virtue of her relative secretiveness, like I said, she was happy to go out amongst the people, but she did have that double life where she stayed at home. And all that came back and wound up costing her. Because unfortunately for the Countess, no one expects the Inquisition. And while it wasn't the Spanish Inquisition, there have been several Inquisitions throughout history. And there's always an Inquisition ready, no matter who you are, to take you out. Even if you're a Countess of good standing and good breeding, playing a vital role on the border, they can still come and find you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Silverlight Show. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. And for those of you who are still paying attention, we wish you all have a fantastic day.